Hello and welcome to this Influencers Peer Evangelism amongst young people in the UK research launch. My name is Dan Randall. I help lead Hope Together, and with a bunch of friends we are bringing you this research which we hope is going to inspire you, encourage you, challenge you, and we just want to thank you for joining us. This research has come out of a number of conversations over the past few years, and we're really excited to see what God is going to do through it, as this is just one step in a process of journeying together to see how we can best equip the church in peer-to-peer evangelism and discipleship. It's a partnership between 7 different organisations and movements: us as Hope Together, Alpha, the Church of England, Youth for Christ, Scripture Union, the Church Army, and Youthscape. And we are bringing you this research together, and we hope that it is a blessing and an encouragement to you. Just one really practical thing to mention, I want to tell you a little bit of the story of how we got here, is that today, like on most webinars, there is a Q&A function and a chat function. We would love to encourage you to use the chat function. There won't be a Q&A in this space, but we want to encourage you to use the chat so that other people can see your questions and therefore see the answers that we're giving. So hopefully then that can help all of us in our learning or understanding or grappling with this research. And so I just want to say a huge thank you for you joining us today. Right at the start of the pandemic, so many things were stopped, weren't they? As youth workers or as church leaders, organisation leaders, whoever you are watching this, that actually we couldn't reach young people in schools, the majority of us, some still could. We couldn't go out on the streets to reach young people. And let's be honest, most of our social medias were okay at best. But the thing that came to the top of the pile about the way that we reach out to young people is through young people. It's the thing that's always been there. It's not a new idea. The idea of peer-to-peer, the idea of a young person reaching another young person isn't a new idea, but it came to the top of the pile. Even the sociologist Judith Harris writes about it, as she talks about almost the invention of the teenager post-war and actually the influence that young people have on each other as they grow, develop, change and shift in life. And that actually through the pandemic, as maybe we saw youth groups change and shift and go through challenges and ups and downs in numbers and all sorts of different challenges, it feels like there's maybe a remnant left, a faithful, bold remnant who, in the midst of a cancel culture where people are getting cancelled for all sorts of things, and that fear of being cancelled because they're a Christian may have emboldened some and frightened others. And so we wanted to encourage and find out what is going on. How are young people actually sharing their faith? And how are they having an influence where they are? And today the research will illuminate just that and so much more. So before I hand over to Jimmy and Lucy, I'd love to pray for us for this time. God, we thank you that you are with us. God, we thank you that you love young people and that you want to see them share you with others. God, we pray that today we will be inspired, emboldened, challenged, equipped, and in our thinking, in our hearts, in all aspects of us, so that we can see more young people reach their peers for Jesus and have an influence for him. Amen. Over to Jimmy and Lucy.
Technical issues. There we go. I'm just going to quickly talk through just some of, I suppose, how we kind of ended out with the methodology that we did for this piece of research. So over the time, as Dan mentioned, that peer-to-peer has always been known to be one of the most effective ways for us to reach young people. However, what tends to come out is whenever we ask about peer-to-peer, peer-to-peer comes out as important. However, there is normally something which comes out higher. So here on the screen, I think we'll get this blown up big. There's 2 pieces of research which both came out in 2016, and they helped to paint some of that picture. So the first one was Gen Z, Rethinking Culture, which was done in 2016 by DJS Research for Youth for Christ. And that found that when we asked young people who or what influences the way they think about faith and religion, friends was the second most important way that happened, but the biggest was family. And then again, in the Talking Jesus Youth piece, which was done in 2016 by Samantha Comres, that actually, again, when you think about the reasons why you became a Christian, the top 2 or 3 things, the top one was growing up in a Christian family. And actually, when we get down to those more peer things like attending youth groups, church services, attending youth services, conversations with Christians that you know well, that comes much lower down. And so essentially what we wanted to say was, well, we know that if you grew up in a Christian family, that your family are going to have an impact. So what about if we talk to some young people who didn't grow up in a Christian family and we asked them about the impact that their friends had on them coming to faith? And so originally we looked to try and do 2 pieces of research. The first one was a qualitative piece. So we looked at doing an online learning community, which was going to run for 7 days. We recruited for that for 3 weeks, and we were looking for 14 to 18-year-olds who had become Christians after the age of 11, that they hadn't grown up in a Christian family, and we offered to pay them £60 to be part of our research project. However, only 16 applied, and out of those 16, that we thought that only 5 of them actually fit the criteria as having grown up in a non-Christian home. So because of that, what we ended up doing was we added a third element. So the second part, which was always going to be there, was going to be that we were going to do a questionnaire, so a quantitative piece. So we did a 45-question questionnaire, which went out to 3,426 young people. From that, 480 of them were deemed to be identified as Christian, and we'll talk through how that kind of happened. But they were 13 to 18, and we asked them about how they shared their faith and a whole bunch of other things. But alongside that, we also did another piece of research, which was another questionnaire, which we did with youth leaders. So that went out to 255 youth leaders from multiple denominations across the UK. And in that, what we did was we asked them not only about how they saw their young people being equipped in peer-to-peer, but also about some of the makeup of what their youth ministry looked like. And part of that was to figure out exactly that question of what we were seeing in that initial response rate. Actually, was that representative? Was it a case that young people who were Christians predominantly only really came from churched families? Within the young people research, one of the things which we did do was we had to identify out of those, how many of those came from a non-Christian background. So the way which we did that was we asked young people a whole bunch of Christian practices, which we'll talk about in a minute. And from that, young people who identified 2 or more Christian practices, they were identified as being practicing Christians. But in amongst those who selected that their family attended church regularly, those who said that they went to church regularly, or that they were part of a church group as children, all of that was pre-11, that they were deemed to have grown up in a Christian family. And so at various points, we'll talk about churched and unchurched young people. And when we're talking about that, that's the breakdown there. So we had 68 young people out of the 480 sample who we believed had grown up outside of a church family. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at this in 3 different parts. So myself and my colleague, Dr. Lucy Shuka, are going to share this between us. So the first part, if we can get that up on the screen, the first part is what role do peers play in young people becoming Christians? And Lucy is going to talk us through some of those findings.
Thanks, Jimmy. So as a reminder, we initially wanted to do this research with young people who'd become Christians as teenagers, because we wanted to explore and test out this idea of whether peers are more important for those who grow up in unchurched backgrounds. We know the family is really important for most of those who are in churches, but we really struggled, as Jimmy explained, to find those young people. And so that's really important to be aware of as we go through these statistics, to hold in mind that actually about 87% of those who we surveyed had grown up in a Christian home. So just keep that in mind as we go through. So we started by asking the 480 young people that we surveyed whether they thought that Christians around their own age had had any influence on them becoming a Christian. And overall, 38% said, yes, I think Christians my own age were a big influence on me becoming a Christian. But that masked a little bit of a difference between those from churched and unchurched backgrounds. So those who didn't grow up in the church were about 10% more likely to say that peers their own age had been some kind of influence on them. So that was in total about 85%, compared to 76% of those who had grown up in a church family. So there's maybe just a little bit of evidence there. It's tentative, but it's a little bit of evidence for the idea that peers maybe play a more important role for children and young people at that age who come to faith from an unchurched background. We then asked, okay, so you think some of these peers had some kind of influence on you, but how? And 70% of those that we surveyed said that they had been influenced in a range of different ways. And because most of these young people had grown up as part of churches, it's maybe not that surprising to see that there's a broadly similar percentage across these different options. 56% had been helped to develop their faith. 55% had had friends tell them about faith. 51% had been invited to something by a friend. And then anyone who chose one of these options was then taken to another question where we asked, okay, tell us more. How did they help you? You said they helped you develop your faith. How did that happen? And you can see there, nearly 60% said that they were given confidence to believe that that was actually a really important thing for how they were influenced. And when I saw that finding, it reminded me of some work that Nick Shepherd had done in his book Faith Generation. I don't know if you've read that, but he did some work on youth groups as plausibility shelters. In other words, that young Christians need other young Christians to see that faith in God is plausible in a secular society. But there's also different kinds of discipleship support here as well, isn't there? They were helped to pray. They were helped to know Jesus. They were able to talk through questions about faith. Young people were also talking to each other. They said, somebody told me about their faith. And that influenced them positively towards that choice to become a Christian themselves. So 50% said friends had talked about why they were a Christian, maybe some kind of apologetic conversation. But more than that, 75% just said friends had given some kind of account of their own relationship with God. So young people just having conversations backwards and forwards. I like this quote here from Dan. We might not be perfect Christians, but the conversations we have encouraged us all the time. Just being around them, I feel more connected with God. Those who had been invited to something were asked, what were you invited to? And they could obviously choose more than one thing. And interestingly, over 3/4 said church. And by what we meant by that was Sunday services. And hopefully you can see by the other options that were given that we are pretty confident that young people assume that that's what we meant as well. But that's what we meant. We're not saying that these other things can't be church, but that's what we meant, Sunday services. And it may be because, of course, not all churches have youth groups. That might explain why young people are more likely or were more likely to say someone had invited them to a Sunday service than a youth group. But even so, I think this is kind of interesting. And I think many of us will have experienced young people growing up in church and then voting with their feet and leaving when they become teenagers. But that's maybe an encouragement that young people are still maybe inviting each other to church on a Sunday. And if so, how do we make that as welcoming and as inclusive a space as we can? And then how did they show you what it is to be a Christian? 2/3 of those who had others show them what it is to be a Christian said peers showed their love for others. It's a ringing endorsement of John 13:35, that by their love for each other, the world will know they are Jesus' disciples. It's only 3% ahead of they went to church and prayed and read the Bible. But I think it's really encouraging that love for others was at the top there. And this quote again is really nice from Chloe, and one of the young people in our online community, who said that her Christian friends exhibited the traits I wanted. I could see it in their character. And then finally, 128 young people told us that friends had introduced them to someone else. And overwhelmingly, this was other Christians their own age, at 73%. And we know from the qualitative part of the study that youth leaders are really important for many young people. But for most of those surveyed, it was a peer group that really helped them grow in their identity as Christians. And I don't know whether the young people in our churches and our youth groups and our ministries would think about making connections between friends, making introductions, that is a kind of evangelism. But it's a really important part of a faith journey and something that we can encourage them in. So I'm going to hand over to Bob and Phil now, who are going to just reflect on what that might mean.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bob Goody. I'm Missions and Evangelism Director at Youth for Christ. And you are?
I am Phil, and I work for Alpha in the UK.
Great. So we're here to sort of do a bit of an interlude, like what stood out for us. What is it the things that we as youth workers, we as people exploring this, what stood out for you? So Phil, what stood out for you so far?
I think one of the things I really loved was the 66% of people that said that it was the love that people showed the others that showed them something about Christianity, and how simple that is for us to help young people just love people well. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate evangelism, don't we? And in actual fact, just loving people is, I think, really impactful.
Yeah. And that's important for young people, isn't it? Like, I remember it was a while ago since I was a young person, but actually that feeling of love, that feeling of acceptance, and we know that young people are looking for community, a place to belong, to feel like they're valued and respected. So yeah, it's great that actually our research is showing, show you're loved, show how much God loves you, and it's going to play an impact.
Yeah.
And I suppose for me, there was that interesting one that Lucy just shared around 77% were invited to church, and that was the primary place. Like, I remember if someone would have invited me to church, so I'm staggered. Like, church is the place that I'm going to invite my friends to, my peers to introduce them to Jesus, to help them live out faith. Like, were you a Christian growing up, or?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in church, but that interested me because I think we all in youth ministry think that we make a really cool environment, and we do cool things, and maybe like dim the lights and have a little bit more fun, and that'll be what young people want to invite their friends to. But I found it quite disturbing in some ways, also quite encouraging that like young people just want to bring their friends to church. Like,
yeah. Has the day passed where youth workers can no longer rely on pizza and hot chocolate
and pool?
Yeah. Anything else stood out for you in that first bit?
Yeah, I think that the stat around that 59% of peers give their friends an opportunity to believe, or more confidence to believe. I found that fascinating, that sometimes I think young people are afraid that they don't have the answers to the right questions, but actually maybe sometimes just in their conversations, they're answering questions that they didn't even know their friends have.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose the last one for me was that 70% are influenced by their Christian friends. Like, how staggering is that? Like, it's not necessarily about me as a youth worker. Like, if I can equip my young people to have the confidence to share their faith, my days, this world is going to change. It's going to look drastically different to what we've seen before if young people are so passionate and fervent about something, about the gospel, that lives are going to be changed. Like, I'm excited for that.
Yeah, so am I.
So I think we should pass back over and hear a bit more of the research. That's what we're here for, after all. Jimmy, why don't you tell us the next part?
Fantastic. So moving on from part one onto part two. So part two, we looked at what do we know about young Christians sharing their faith with peers. And this section will feel like it's two different parts. We mentioned in the methodology at the start that given the response rate that we had originally to trying to find those from an unchurched family, part of what we wanted to try and get a picture of is what do we know about young Christians? And so the first part of what we're going to talk about here is kind of what do we know about young Christians, and then we'll kind of move on to talking more broadly about actually the young Christians who we know, how are they sharing their faith. So one of the things that we asked youth workers was, thinking about the young people who you have in your youth ministry, we wanted to know how many do you think you have, but we wanted them to break them down into 4 different sections. These aren't perfect, but hopefully they help give a little bit of a guide. So the first section is what we've called active disciples. So active disciples are those who have made some form of faith commitment and are actively investing in their faith. Beyond that, you've got faith explorers, so those who are asking questions about faith and are open to further exploration. So it might be that they haven't decided to make a commitment of faith, but they would come along to an alpha course or something which you were doing if you did a kind of question and answer apologetics evening, they'd be the first people there. The third group was Fringe Engagers. So Fringe Engagers are those who will come along, they get stuck into everything. Doesn't really matter if it's got faith or not, but you know what, not huge levels of interest. And the final group, which we've called the Not Engaged, which isn't a perfect title at all, but essentially these are those who will come along and they'll engage in stuff, as long as it doesn't have a faith element. If it has a faith element, they're out, they're not coming. But if it does, if it doesn't, then they're there. So what we've got here is we've got the breakdown for the average youth group. So the average youth group has 25 young people, apparently. 11 of those, so 44%, so nearly half of them are active disciples. That we've got 7 of them, nearing on for 8, who are faith explorers, so 30%. Fringe Engagers, you've got nearing on for 5, so that's 19%. And the not engaged, there's only just under 2, so 7%. I think this is really fascinating because I think that we had a 90s model of youth ministry, which was all about come, dodgeball, hot chocolate, come play the games, and we'll talk about Jesus really quietly because it's all about just building that community. And actually what we're seeing here is that the makeup of the average youth group is over nearly half is people who are already active Christians, and that you've got a third who are actively wanting to go deeper and explore faith more. So for me, that's really encouraging, but it definitely builds a picture that we have youth ministries that factor around discipleship rather than evangelism. We also mentioned earlier about the idea that when we were defining what it meant to be a Christian, that we had a whole number of practices. So these were the practices which we had. We asked young people, how many of these do they do at least once a month? And 79% pray on their own, 75% go to church, 58% engage with the Bible. The thing which is really interesting with this is that when we were originally discussing as a team, how would we define a Christian, that there was a lot of debate about this and trying to pick this. If you're a bit of a research junkie, you'll spend a lot of time looking at research. You'll notice that what is a Christian, how are we defining a Christian, shifts and changes. And so for us, we opted for 2 of those practices. But we also asked that question of youth workers as well. So within this, it drew out some really interesting findings. If we can get this slide up a bit bigger. So 87% of the young people taking part in the research were from a church background. So this is what we talked about earlier, where they or their members of their family attended church regularly. Most young Christians consider themselves to be Christians before the age of 11. And actually, if you spoke to those who were from an unchurched background, there was still 69% of unchurched young people who considered themselves to be Christians before the age of 11. So just as a bit of a visual for that, the little army of people there, that's 100 young people. So if you took 100 Christian young people, all of the young people in pink grew up in a Christian family. That actually the ones in blue, that they didn't grow up in a Christian family, but before the age of 11, they've decided that they want to be a Christian. So actually, if we're talking about evangelism with unchurched young people after the age of 11, out of 100 young people, you're talking about 4 young people. So actually, we are saturated with church-based young people. And I think this has got a huge impact for them when we start to think about how we share more broadly. We asked youth workers about the young people who they had, and half of them, 49% of youth workers, felt their churches had no active disciples who were from a non-Christian home, and 83% said that they had 5 or less. And actually further than that, which for me, I think is probably one of the really terrifying stats, a quarter of youth workers, 24%, said that they felt that their churches had no contact with any young people, regardless of engagement levels, from a non-Christian background. I mean, that's a huge number of churches who are only reaching those young people who are already within their church. When it comes to evangelism, this has got a huge impact. Obviously, this report is all around peer-to-peer. And so we went on to ask the young people about how they were reaching out. And actually, what I think we see as a thread through this is that sometimes the cultures that we are establishing as youth workers are being passed on to young people. So when we asked young people about their regular connections, half of them, 49%, said that all or most of their friends were Christians. 39% of the youth workers said that their church's youth ministry, we asked youth workers whether their youth ministry was retention focused, or was it about holding on to and discipling the church-based young people, or was it focused on outreach and reaching out to young people who were outside? So 39% said that their youth ministry was focused solely or mainly on retention, compared to only 8% whose sole or main focus was on outreach. However, then when you ask those youth workers to think more aspirationally moving forward, what you found was that only 7% said that they wanted the main focus to be on retention, compared to the vast majority, 85%, who said that they wanted a far more balanced engagement between outreach and retention. So moving on from there, the Christian young people who we spoke to, we asked them, do you think that you've ever influenced your non-Christian connections to explore Christianity? There's a small group, so 11% who said, yeah, I've definitely done that. A much bigger group, so nearly half, 49%, who said that they think they have, but it's only a little bit. And a lot of that will just be around kind of confidence predominantly, I would imagine, and kind of how much they see the effect. But a much bigger, so 30% said not very much at all, and 10% are saying that they haven't influenced their peers at all. There's a couple of quotes there from some young people where they have tried to share their faith. So Megan, age 17, has said, I also try to bring up with friends whenever I get the chance and have lots of interesting conversations and debates with different friends. I feel that conversations I've had with people have definitely enlightened them more on what it means to be a Christian, what it really means, but I don't feel any conversations have led to any of my friends becoming more interested in faith themselves, yet at least. I think that's where that, yes, a little influence comes in, that unless I speak to my friend and they decide there and then they want to become a Christian, how effective has that been? Have I actually shared my faith? When we asked young people, so Lucy talked earlier about this idea of telling, showing, inviting, helping and introducing. And we asked this in two different parts. So we asked the young people to reflect back on their own Christian journey about how they felt faith had been shared with them. But then we also asked them the same questions, but thinking about how they then shared their faith with others. We're going to be sending out the report after this. I'd really encourage you to hold those two in parallel with each other, because it's really interesting, the kind of more effective ways that young people will reach themselves aren't necessarily the ways which they are choosing to share their faith with their friends. So looking through these, the number one way that young people are looking to share their faith with their friends is through telling. So 71% said that they have told non-Christian peers about their faith. 41%, that's quite a big drop from 71% down to 41%, showing them what it means to be a Christian. 35% had invited them to something. 30% had helped their friends to develop their own faith. And 21% had introduced their peers to another Christian. So just to kind of break down some of those. So that top one, so telling, what did you tell them about your faith? The number one thing that they told them was why I am a Christian. One of the things that we see come out of this as a narrative is what do young people mean when they talk about sharing their faith? And I think you've got two things which potentially that could mean. I think when it comes to sharing your faith, I think for a lot of people, what they envision is they envision the idea of kind of what we might call proclamational faith sharing. So I'm going to stand up, I'm going to give you a gospel presentation, and then I'm going to give you an offer to give your life to Jesus. But actually what comes out is far more of a willingness to engage with what we might call narrative evangelism. So let me tell you my own story about how I see God at work in what I'm doing. Why am I a Christian? About my relationship with God, how God helps me in the everyday. This was so overwhelmingly the biggest way that young people were choosing to share their faith. I think that's really interesting. So the second one down was we showed them what it meant to be a Christian, and we picked up on this earlier. The top answer, 64%, by showing love for others, by having hope and a purpose, by doing things like going to church, praying and reading the Bible. Again, it's that idea by showing love for others. I think what's kind of interesting with this is that going back to that group who said that they felt that they'd influenced them, but maybe only a little bit, that actually where maybe they did some of this, and this is purely conjecture, but maybe where they'd done some of this, where they tried to show love and they hadn't actually verbalized in a kind of more of a proclamational way what it meant for them to have a faith, that actually they'd been trying to show love, that had been an active way which they've been looking to share faith. But then, as we covered, maybe not as confident about the impact of that. The third one, what they invited them to. So really interestingly, this parallels what we saw earlier with the ways that young people were invited. So the top answer, again, by an absolute landslide, is church. 72% saying that church was the biggest thing which they were going to invite them to. I think one of the things that comes through really strongly in this is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that I think we have quite an invite culture in the UK church that actually will invite you to something. And actually what we're finding here is that actually young people are far more likely to share a narrative and show people what it means for them to follow Jesus, rather than to invite them to something. And if they are inviting them to something, they're not inviting them to the things which we might think that they're going to invite them to. Some of the lower options, I think, probably might be some of the things which we would think would be the obvious first choice, but actually it's church which comes out top. Next up, how did you help them to develop their faith? Again, kind of paralleling what we found earlier, so it gave them confidence to believe, came top, 57%, made it more acceptable to have faith, 54%, discussed my questions about faith, 52%. And then final one of these, which Christians did you introduce them to? No huge surprise here. The top answer by an absolute landslide was other Christians their own age, so 71%. A youth leader came second at 38%, someone who inspired them 37%, and a church leader 35%. We also went on to ask a bunch of other questions around social media in particular. This was a quote from one of the young people. It's usually not long before people I meet know that I'm a Christian because I try to share my faith on social media. And that means people do tend to ask questions, which has led to conversations with various non-Christian friends. I think during the pandemic, where we kind of had to shift from this very in-person upfront culture to everything being online, we saw a huge number of ministries try and develop their social media presence and how we better engage with people online. So we asked the young people a little bit about this and how they did that. So we asked young people, how are they sharing their faith? And the top way which they share their faith is through Bible quotes or reflections at 73%. Those who did share shared in a variety of ways. 87% selected 3 or more ways that they shared their faith on social media. And young people were more likely to share content or videos created by other people, so 31%, rather than content or videos that they created themselves. The final thing on this, and then we're going to hand back over to Bob and Phil, is we asked young people, firstly, about which platforms they were sharing on. Instagram was by far the most popular, so that was used by 77%, followed by WhatsApp, 43%, and Snapchat at 40%. But this I thought was a really interesting element. 43% of young people said that they have at least one separate social media account for sharing faith, with lots of the young people telling us that they have multiple accounts. So actually, it's almost like they are sectioning off a section of their faith onto they're siphoning it off into a separate account. And the final thing is over a third, so 35% of unchurched young people said that they connect with Christian peers only or mainly online, compared to just 13% from church backgrounds, suggesting that actually the online stuff that we do is particularly important context for those who didn't grow up in a church. So actually for those who are in that unchurched group, that the online spaces which we host, that actually for them, that is their primary community for connecting with other Christians. I'm going to hand back over to Bob and Phil, who are going to give us some of their thoughts on that.
I don't know how you feel at the back of that. I'll be honest, I didn't come from a Christian background. None of my family are Christians. And so to suddenly hear this, that 24% aren't engaging with young people outside of church, I'm like, why? Like, surely that is the Great Commission. That's what we're here to do. Like, I wouldn't be here today, like living probably, if it wasn't for youth workers going, I need to not focus too much on retention. Like, that is a good thing. We need the discipleship, but actually everyone needs to know who Jesus is. And so I'm riled. I'm like, youth workers, I want to grab you and just anyway, sorry, Phil, what do you think?
I do think that the encouraging part from that sort of those statistics was that 85% wanted a more balanced approach. I think that quarter was with people who felt their church didn't do it right now, but I was encouraged that there were so many people who felt that was something they wanted to pursue more. And like Bob said, please pursue the unchurched more. But that really encouraged me, and I suppose what then encouraged me alongside that and almost made me a bit nervous was the number of unchurched people that were still Christians before they were 11.
Yeah.
You kind of assume that would be people that had grown up in church. But such a high number of unchurched young people that came to faith before the age of 11. And if that doesn't make us need to be even more intentional with trying to reach the other 30% after they're 11, then I don't know what does.
Yeah. And I wonder what it is that can stop us in that. Like, everyone has this desire. I want to do the outreach. I want to go and meet young people. I want to be able to share Jesus relevantly in every place and space that we encounter them. And unsurprisingly, as we saw, young people are online. Well, I wasn't surprised by that. But actually, like, what's stopping us? Is it sometimes that we have this I've got to have the bums on seats, I've got to have the numbers, and I've got my mission statistics that I need to write down? Or is it actually, as people of God that are passionate about young people, is our desire to see them come to know Jesus? That's going to be the driving force. And I love the fact that people want that to be their driving force.
Yeah, the other thing I just found interesting was, I'm not surprised that so many young people engage with social media and evangelism, but I do find it interesting that almost safety blanket that they put in place of doing it through a third sort of account where they're maybe not named, or even just the fact that they're more likely to reshare other people's content. I think that safety blanket is interesting, and what it showed me was that part of my role in helping young people reach their friends is helping them to be bold and doing it not just on social media through a third party, but doing it themselves and having that boldness to really go for it.
And I think it plays into what you shared in the last interlude, and it was, are young people ready and equipped to be able to answer the questions? And sometimes having that third party to help them answer the questions is really pivotal too. So maybe there's a lot for us to think about, but there's even more for us to think about. So Lucy, why don't you give us some more?
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is the last section, and then we'll let you go. But this is focused on what the barriers might be to peer evangelism, and what is it that young people actually want from us? What can we do to support them? And you can actually sort of see maybe some of our assumptions in the way we phrased this. We were just making assumptions that this is hard in this culture to expect or invite young people to talk about their faith is really hard. So there's going to be a lot of barriers. Actually, we were pleasantly surprised. Sometimes we did a bit of a double take. So is this right? That maybe young people were more positive or more open to sharing their faith than we might have assumed. So we gave them a number of statements and we asked them to say, are any of these true for you? And when asked how sharing their faith affected them, so these were any young people who said that they had in some way shared their faith, which is about 90%. 51% said it helped me remember why I'm a Christian, and a similar percentage said it inspired them and it strengthened their faith. And again, maybe speaking personally, I have some horror stories. I remember from attempting to do this and it not going very well. But actually, when it does, and it's authentic, and it actually has a really positive impact, not just on the person who's hearing, but on the person who takes that risk as well. And that's really lovely to remember. And no, there are young people out there who say their own faith has been strengthened because they took the risk of sharing it with someone else. So yes, it's fair to say we were slightly surprised that maybe in the culture we're living in, that peer evangelism wasn't seen to be just really negative. But actually 70% of those we surveyed, of that 480, either agreed or strongly agreed that they should try to encourage others to become Christians. Now, depending on how you read this, you might emphasize the should. It might be that what we're getting there is young people saying, I've been told that I should do this, so I think I should do it. But that's part of the reason we do anonymous surveys, to try to get around some of that sense of pressure. And I think on an anonymous survey, it is still, I think, quite surprising that so many young people think, yeah, actually, that's something that I think I should do. We maybe would have expected a bit more ambivalence about that in a kind of you do you culture, that you might encourage others to adopt your belief system. And in fact, again, surprisingly, we found that the majority of the young people that we surveyed actually said they were confident to share their faith with others. 65% said that, and 80% said they would like to have more confidence. So you can look at this chart and sort of try to make sense of it when you get the report, but it basically tries to plot the young people depending on whether they had confidence and wanted more, or had confidence and didn't want more. And it really only just shows you that about 5% said, I'm confident and I don't want any more confidence, thank you. And only 1% said, I'm not confident and I don't want to be confident, please leave me alone. The rest, the simple takeaway here, is that your young people may actually be more confident than you expect, some of them, but they still need encouragement. And I like that quote from Caleb just there, who compared it to football. And he's like, I do football 5 times a week. Maybe if I practice this a bit more, I'd be better at it. That was an interesting comparison. In case anyone at this point is thinking this is unreasonably positive, don't worry. Young people did tell us about some of the barriers and some of the difficult experiences and some of the fears when it comes to being open with peers about faith. So Lauren here said, I find it really difficult because of the fear they will judge you. And Grace said, when people ask me questions, I don't know how to answer. And for her, it's actually because it feels like it's all on her shoulders. If she doesn't give the right answer, what if they get pushed further away from Christ? Surely it's better not to say anything. So we asked, okay, what puts you off sharing faith? And this is what we found in the survey. We had that quote from Grace on the previous slide that it's maybe easier to stay silent when you don't know what to say to difficult questions. And that was actually the top answer. 38% said, what if I don't know the answers to difficult questions? And so for those of you whose ministry is about equipping young people to have some of the answers to those questions, that's really important. Many of the rest of these will feel very familiar to you. A lack of interest, a lack of confidence, fear of embarrassment, being judged, or maybe being excluded. But I would also note that actually those percentages are still relatively low. There's nothing there that is above 40%. So young people are not in this survey giving us a very strong message that this is really difficult and overwhelming and we don't want to go anywhere near it. They're actually saying, I'd like to be more confident. I'd like to do this more. And actually what we found when we compared the data from young people with the data from our youth leader survey, a really interesting pattern came up across a number of these barriers, which is that the youth leaders perceived a number of these things to be more problematic for young people than the young people did for themselves. So 70% of youth leaders we surveyed thought young people are put off by fear of embarrassment, but only 29% of young people themselves said that. And the same was true for challenging questions and for low confidence. So those purple bars there are the youth leaders. And what does that mean? What do we take from that? Do young people find it hard to admit that these things put them off? Possibly. We did also find that 30% of the youth leaders we surveyed didn't necessarily agree that they were good role models when it came to sharing faith. And of course, young people catch from us what we are and who we are and how we live as much as they do what we say. So for those of us who have hangovers ourselves from peer evangelism, good or bad experiences, maybe that's something that we need to be aware of as well. Another just interesting thing to note in that last slide is that while 45% of young Christians from a churched background identified 3 or more barriers to sharing faith, this was only 23% of those from an unchurched background. And I think many of us will have encountered young people who've just become Christians as teenagers, and actually they will just talk about that, what has happened to them, talk about their faith quite quickly and quite easily. Whereas those maybe who've grown up in the church find that harder and feel there are more barriers, and they may need more encouragement. Our youth leader survey also showed that youth leaders, and by extension the churches that they told us about, seem to put a lot of emphasis on making invitations when they are talking about peer evangelism. So 81% said, my church encourages peer evangelism primarily through getting young people to invite their friends to something. That's also what youth leaders expect active disciples to be doing. That's the kind of primary model of evangelism. And yet in making an invitation came relatively low down. You will have seen those colourful bar charts. We've had them in different guises. In making an invitation is not generally at the top of those. And actually, in particular, for the unchurched young people in our sample, it's not a very big subsample, it's quite small, but they said peers were more likely to have talked to them about faith than to have invited them to something. And it was 35% of our whole sample that said they had invited a peer to something, and 71% who said they'd talked about faith. It's not that young people aren't willing to do inviting. Actually, 90% said, I'd be willing to invite friends to something, even though not many of them are necessarily doing it now. And so we presented them with a list and said, okay, well, which of these would you invite a friend to? And surprise, surprise, we've seen it already. There's church, top of the list again, 56%, compared with 38% being willing to invite a young person to a Christian youth group and 32% to a festival or a camp. And again, that seems a little surprising. It's an encouragement to think about young people inviting their peers to church, but it also, I think, invites us to stop and broaden our expectations about what young people are willing to do, and also the ways that they share faith. And then finally, we asked young people, what help would you like? Is there anything that we can do that would help you in sharing faith with your friends? Now, these responses don't suggest to me that they are desperate for lots of help, which is interesting. Again, we've got relatively low percentages here, but I think it's interesting to note that the top two answers are really add up to having conversations and telling some stories about what it is like to share faith with friends. Only a fifth were interested in that kind of more formal training, although they did want some specific advice on how to talk about difficult questions. But I think one thing we could take from that is it's relatively simple to just get in a room with some young people and say, what is this like for you to actually do? And we said, okay, what do you think would help? What could adults do that would help young people? And here are some of their ideas. Find people who've shared their faith to talk about it, maybe some tips. Pointing out that sharing faith can actually help the person doing the sharing. It's not necessarily going to just leave you feeling that was challenging. It can strengthen your faith. Have open conversations with us. Teach people how to do it. Teach us how to calmly debate with people who don't believe. I'm just going to end this section with a quote that came from a young person in our online community that I think captures a number of the things that we picked up in the research. The thing that helped me most, I think, is the realization that at the end of the day, as long as it's important to you and you want to talk about it, authenticity, and you feel it's right to talk about it, you don't have to overly worry about what other people will say or what other people will think, i.e. whether or not you really are always having the influence, because just have faith in the fact that you, just like in every other moment, God has got you in that conversation and will help you find the strength to just be completely open with other people. I don't know if it's just my personal experience, but I found that people will say not very nice things on social media. It's not always easy, but I have found having these conversations in person, I feel as if the other person or people can see your vulnerability and can see passion and your love. Over to you, Bob and Phil.
Wow. Big stuff coming out. And I just love that thought that us as youth workers, we have a perspective and a view of young people, and young people are like, I don't quite believe that view is true. And how interesting is that? That actually our view is different, and that's a good thing. So what stood out for you from that last part?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing that stands out for me from that section is it's the differences in the barriers that we as youth leaders see to evangelism and young people. And I do think there's probably various things around that and reasons for it, but I do think it makes me more aware that I need to be careful of not putting my own baggage and my own fears and planting them on young people and saying, no, but you don't have the confidence to do that, but actually listening to what their perspective is and letting them be empowered in that way. I just find that fascinating, like a different, and part of that is also we've been there. And I think sometimes young people maybe think more of themselves, not in a bad way, but like it means that we can be aware that maybe they don't understand that might be a barrier, but we can also equip them for the moment that maybe it becomes one.
Yeah. And I love the fact that young people are confident to share their faith. Like they are confident and they want to know more too. And so again, we come back to that question, don't we? Like, do I know the answer to all these questions? Well, not knowing the answers, 38% said that was one of their barriers to sharing their faith with their friends. And like for me, honesty moment, if I don't know something, but I believe it's pretty much there, if you say it with enough confidence, people believe you. But that's not what I'm going to encourage young people to do. But actually, how do we equip them to be able to understand the big questions, to do the apologetics piece almost, like how do I talk to my friends, answer their questions? And it could be we point more towards some of these third parties, as we've talked about. How do I share my third party stuff on social media and those kind of questions?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that stuff that encouraged me was that the young people saying that the fear was not knowing the answer to difficult questions indicates to me a willingness to listen to the difficult questions. And what that shows me is that they're not expecting to just walk up to a non-Christian friend, talk at them for 30 minutes and then leave. But they actually, in that period of conversation, they're expecting it to come back at them, which I think is essential. And I think that there's something encouraging about the fact that they're worried about difficult questions, because it shows that they are willing to listen to them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I was encouraged by was just at the very end there about sharing stories, and how young people, how we could help them was by sharing stories of other people sharing their faith, or giving them an opportunity to talk to people that have shared their faith. And I think that that's something that we can all do. We can all put people in place and say, listen, this is when it went well, and this is when it didn't go well. But at the end of the day, this is how it felt, and this is how it's going to feel. And giving young people to look up to, and not just the person on the stage that preaches the gospel, but maybe another young person that shows the gospel, demonstrates the gospel, and communicates it in everyday language as well.
Yeah, our testimony is the most powerful thing we have, pretty much, isn't it? And sharing those stories, it's an encouragement, it's a challenge, it brings everything together. So to create that, I think probably the final thing for me was that invitational culture that we heavily sort of major on, but sometimes we don't as well. So a few years ago, I talked to a whole load of churches straight after Christmas, and they were like, yeah, we had loads of non-Christians coming, loads of families, loads of people engaged, young people coming to this and that and the other. And it's like, what did you ask them to next? Oh, we didn't. We just said, we'll see you next Christmas, because that's how church goes. And like, young people aren't particularly interested in the invitation, but I think we still need that power of invitation to play a part, to have those moments where young people can come and hear and respond and be discipled. So as we draw to a close on this research, and before Dan comes to share a little bit more with us before we end, I wonder if we just take 20 seconds, 30 seconds, just to have a bit of silence, to contemplate, what is it that stood out for me? What is it that's already stirring within me? Is there a challenge? Is there an inspiration? Like, what has this research done that I'm now going to put into action? So let's just take a few seconds in our own spaces just to contemplate that.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us today. I've been so encouraged as we've been immersed in this research, journeying with this research, that actually young people are influencers, and not just to get famous, but influencers for Jesus, and they want to share their faith. And so I just want to encourage you as we finish that not to separate this off as an evangelism only conversation or a discipleship only, but a merger of the two. That actually maybe, just maybe, one of the greatest fruits of our discipleship could be young people who boldly share their faith. And maybe, just maybe, evangelism isn't just about hands up at events, however important those moments are, but about committing to that journey with young people, and therefore empowering them and equipping them to share their faith with their friends. And so actually the fruit of our evangelism can spur more young people on to share their faith. It's part of our discipleship process and empowering them. I just want to say a special thank you to all the partners who've been involved in this, but a particular mention to Scripture Union and the Church Army, who you've not seen visible here today for multiple different reasons, but they are a massive part of this, and we just want to give them a big shout out. They've been key in this research, working hard behind the scenes on a number of different things, and so we want to thank them and the other 5 partners too. The report is now live on 4 different websites. You're going to see it in the chat right now. Youth for Christ website, Youthscape's website, Scripture Union's website, and Hope Together's website. You can get it there, you can download it. And then later this week, this recording of this webinar will be available for you to see, share, and watch again at your own leisure. Also, because you signed up today, you also get these things straight into your inbox as well. So you can access it in all sorts of different ways, but please do share the website, share the webinar with others so that they can be helped, encouraged, stirred, and maybe, just maybe, that church leader you're working with and maybe you're a youth leader and you really want to stir them for a passion for evangelism and discipleship with young people, share it with them. Or maybe you're a church leader and you think, my youth leader really needs to see this. Or you're someone else, whatever your work may be, let it encourage someone else, let it challenge someone else, let it inspire them and equip them in what they're doing. A big thank you for joining us today, and I'd love to pray a blessing over all of us as we finish. God, we thank you that you are the one that helps us to see what is unseen. God, we thank you for tools like research. Thank you that gives us prophetic insight into what you're up to, things that we never even knew. But also it shows us the reality of where we need to serve and help young people and serve your church together. Thank you for unity and that we get to do this thing together, called church, and reaching young people and discipling them for you, Jesus. Amen. Thank you for joining us, and please check out the report.